I'm going to focus on dual purpose crops because that's what I have been working on. The request from the GRDC was that we talk a little bit about how they integrate into the whole farming system. So that's how I've structured my talk. I want to talk briefly about the dual purpose cereals. Hugh and others have done a lot more work on them than I, so I will just touch briefly on some of his recent research highlights. I'll talk a bit about the dual purpose canola, where I have been working, and then how I think they might fit together in a system. So that's how I'm going to structure things. And I'd just like to acknowledge, and particularly in this area, the assistance from both Delta Agribusiness and Agritech, who've helped me a lot with my experiments and discussions around here and trying to make the research both plausible and think about the cost benefit, going back to Jim's talk, and my other co-authors. So look, whether you are talking about dual purpose wheat or dual purpose canola or any dual purpose crop, essentially this is sort of the concept. This is the year along the bottom here, and look, depending on whether you're in the tablelands or in a sort of a high medium rainfall zone such as this, or a little bit further west, and we probably have people consulting to all of those areas, there is a way that you can utilise dual purpose crops in your system. It essentially just changes the timing of things, but the basic concept is that you are sowing an otherwise grain only crop a little bit earlier than normal, in order to capitalise on the autumn growth opportunities to produce a sort of a feed wedge here in winter when your stock operation needs that feed, but to do it in such a way that you can recover the crops back into a sort of somewhat of a normal grain only window so as not to lose yield. Now, depending on your focus on your animal enterprise or your grain enterprise, you know, there is a bit of trade-off you can deal with in here, cop a little bit of a hit on the yield in order to get some extra grazing, but that's really enterprise specific. And so whether you're really back here with a really long season winter type, which gives you a very long period of grazing, or whether you're just going in and getting a bit of free feed off a canola or a wheat crop with sort of lighter stock numbers, all those things are possible, and so just keep that in mind as we go through. I guess in this area we have been a lot of the work's been, you know, this type of thing. And so look, there's a lot of components you've got to get right to make this work. You've got to have, you know, good livestock management. You've got to be on the ball with your crop agronomy. But importantly, even getting those things right, you've got to be thinking about how it fits into your whole farm economics and operations. And that's something I think Peter might talk a little bit more about. I'll deal with some of that. As I said, I just wanted to touch briefly on the cereal job. I mean, Hugh's done a lot more work on that, and I think the consultants, particularly in this area, have really fine-tuned that extremely well. But just to sort of remind you that if you get the grazing management right with dual-purpose cereals, and the key thing is to graze in the safe window and lock the crop up before growth stage 31, you can get grazing off the crop without taking a big hit in yield. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a season that is a 7-tonne season or a 4-tonne season or even a howling drought. This is data from Hugh Dove showing that the stocking rate and the stocking intensity is less important to the outcome than grazing in that safe window. So in all these situations, the crop was grazed in the safe window, and grazing intensity, the amount of grazing, didn't have any impact on yield at all. And even in a poor season, you know, he got some kick from taking a bit of biomass out of the crop in the middle of winter. So really that's just to remind you that, you know, the crop can recover from what looks like pretty heavy grazing, provided you do it in this safe window. And that goes for winter wheats and spring wheats, and there might be a bit of fine tuning around that, but as far as I know, this general rule has held up quite well. The other work Hugh has been doing a lot of is in terms of the live weight gains. He did a lot of work looking at why the live weight gains in animals was variable between different cereals, and a lot of work, he did a lot of work that led him to believe that was potentially something to do with a mineral deficiency in the wheat. And to cut a long story short, wheat is a crop that excludes sodium at the root. So no matter what soil you're on, wheat forage will be marginal for sodium. And when ruminants have low sodium and high potassium, in their rumens, they cannot absorb magnesium. So grazing stock on wheat can induce a magnesium absorption problem, which can be fixed either by giving them magnesium as a supplement or by giving them sodium to sort of overcome the absorption problem, or in fact when you give them both you can get an added effect. And this is just a summary of a lot of trials that Hugh has done and some previous work by New South Wales Ag with cattle, just to show that whether it's cattle or sheep, their live weight gains can be increased significantly. All of these are significant, incidentally. These are percentage increases in live weight gain. All of them can be increased by the provision of a cheap CosMag supplement, and these are some of the numbers that Hugh has got in his talk. Incidentally, there's a lot more detail in the paper, so I'd suggest you have a look at that if you're interested in any of this. So that's very cheap, a cheap, good return on investment. So the dual purpose canola, why did we get interested in that? Initially it was particularly for the dual purpose wheats, which are coming into the system, being sown early, growing for a longer period of time. The potential to build up disease and weed problems in the system is greater for some of those longer dual purpose crops. And so we started thinking about the need for a break crop to really get the best out of those dual purpose high yielding opportunities. We also found that canola in those dry seasons through the 2000s was just slipping out of the rotation because it was risky, and we were looking for a way to take some of the risk and build some profitability back into canola. But also, canola and cereals just have different operational windows, so on the farm it just made sense if you could have a grazing crop. Also, when wheat streak mosaic came in, we had taken away from us the sort of really early sowing opportunity, so we wondered what we could do with canola as another high value dual purpose crop. So we did a lot of work on variety selection and grazing management, funded by the GRDC through these years, and with a lot of collaboration locally, as I said, to develop some best bet strategies. And I have talked about these before, they're in the notes, but just to briefly go over them. For dual purpose canola, obviously it's important to be selecting a paddock that perhaps you had already planned for canola, and if you're going to sow early and you're looking for grazing as well as grain, good moisture to start with is going to be a big benefit. We have had success by just sowing later maturing varieties for the area a couple of weeks early, as I said, to build that feed base, and we've had good success with that strategy. That's provided good grazing winter, and obviously you need to be prepared. You need to have your gear ready, you need to, you may be sowing into slightly marginal moisture, so you need to be prepared for that opportunity. In terms of variety selection, the first thing to do is select the right phenology for that sowing time and your environment. But other things with canola, you must use a variety with good blackleg resistance. Varieties with low blackleg resistance succumb to high levels of blackleg after grazing. The grazing can increase blackleg infection. If you're looking for early feed, obviously better vigour in the crop, so hybrids are a good option in that regard. TTs tend to have less vigour. But overriding all of these, I think, for canola is that the canola's in the system to provide you with a weed break. The last thing you want to do is create a bigger weed problem. So think about your weed control. What type of canola variety do you need to get on top of the weeds in that paddock, and think about the chemical withholding periods related to that variety, and just make sure you are going to give yourself an opportunity to graze when you need the feed. And what I will say about varieties, we have had success with a range of varieties just taking these things into account. Hybrids from different companies, etc., have all performed well if you follow these guidelines, but this will be probably the thing that decides it for you. In terms of grazing, you can start grazing when the plants are anchored, very similar situation to the cereals, and when there's adequate biomass. It tends to be about the 6 to 8 leaf period, and around here it tended to be in that mid to late June area. But importantly, again, lock up before the buds are elongating more than 10 centimetres. I'll show you a little bit about this to avoid the yield loss. And if you are grazing later, because the feed's of value to you, just graze it a bit moderately, and if you don't remove the buds, you'll tend not to suffer a flowering delay and a yield loss. We have been getting typically 600 or 800 DSE days grazing, 4 to 6 weeks of 25 DSE off the canola that's been grazed commercially. So expect about that, and have been generally top dressing nitrogen after the grazing, both to avoid any impact with nitrate poisoning in the stock and also to give the crop a boost coming away from the graze. Rather than put up a whole lot of data, I think I just want you to have a look at these comments. Canola has been grazed now in this area for the last 3 to 4 years. It's been fine-tuned by the consultants and growers, and we did a lot of data. We have got to back it up, but I think commercial experience is saying it is working. Last year's probably the first chance we got it at an early sowing and a reasonable spring. We had late sowings and shitty springs and late sowings and good springs, but last year it seemed to come together pretty well, and Peter might comment on that after morning tea. So just to show you some of those rules of thumb, sorry again, the time to start grazing, if there's adequate feed there and you can't tug the plant out easily, then you can start grazing if you need the feed, or you know, something like this is typical of how plants look, 6 to 8 leaf stage. Here is the bud emerging, and so you need to keep an eye on that. Obviously, if the bud starts to elongate quite high, the stock will come in and start preferentially nipping that off. Once that bud's gone, the canola's got to reshoot from the base, which it will do. And if there's time and if the season's kind to you, it will regrow without any yield penalty, but that is a risk. So if you sort of avoid removing that bud, you'll tend to avoid yield loss. But that's a sort of a decision about the value of the feed versus the grain. And just to show you data from a range of sites, and these are sort of standard error bars for Jim. These are the flowering delay caused by grazing in different areas. If you're grazing in that vegetative stage or when the bud's visible, you know, you're only going to get a 3-4 day delay in flowering. Once the bud starts to elongate and the animals are actually taking that bud out when they're grazing, you start to get up more into the 10-day, 20-day flowering delay, and that causes the risk of yield loss at the other end. If the season's like last year, the crop may well recover, but you can't guarantee that. And incidentally, people sort of use this information as well to kind of slow down crops that have accelerated a bit quickly through a warm autumn. You know, you put them in early, you have a warm autumn, they're rushing through. You can use the grazing to sort of bring that crop back into the flowering window that you're looking for, so it sort of can be used in that way as well. Just to show you some data from some trials that we did back in 2008, and this is from the sort of earlier sowing window. We've been doing a lot of experiments with a winter variety called Taurus, similar to say a McKellar wheat or a wedge-tail wheat. This is a winter variety, has a vernalisation requirement, so you can sow it quite early and it still won't flower until it's had the cold requirement. And you can see that we got quite a lot of grazing off that from a 7th of April sowing. A lot of grazing because it'll stay vegetative and it still recovered to produce good yield. These were good seasons in young. We had full profile of water and it was a reasonable season at this site. But equally, you know, the typical long season hybrids, there are newer ones now, but these sorts of hybrids sown in mid-April, you know, also with reasonable amount of grazing, still recovered to produce good yield, following those best bet rules. You can see if you hit it a bit hard and a bit late, we took that one through to August, you know, we did get a yield penalty from that. In a different site in the same year, just to show as well that the TTs sometimes take a bit of a yield hit if you graze them intensively in that period. But you know, there are conventionals and hybrids and a range of varieties that can all be made to work, just depending on your requirement. At that site, a normal canola crop sown, ungrazed on the 12th of May, yielded 3.1 tonnes. So, you know, you're kind of not suffering a big yield penalty. Last year, just to show you some data from last year, and we haven't fully analysed this yet, but I was sort of interested in going before 15th of April. I mean, the consultants and their growers are making it work pretty well with available varieties around here, but we took it back to sowing right around the 10th of March. And here's that winter variety, and you can see whether we grazed it, sorry, this is ungrazed and this is grazed for each variety. Just look at the winter variety. You can see as you go through from these early sowing times that its yield is holding up, and particularly under grazing it's holding up. This wasn't a significant difference, but that's the value of these sort of winter types that'll just stay vegetative through that period. This is the sort of hybrid under the same treatments. And you can see that sowing it in March, it's flowering very early, and when we grazed it, we were able to delay flowering by 75 days to try and, so we just had to keep on top of that one. And look, it did come through and yield okay, but we took a hit compared to the ungrazed. And this just becomes a lot more difficult to manage, and I wouldn't sort of recommend it, but it just shows the value of the winter types. And I mean, that's been shown in the cereals. They just have a sort of robust performance. But what has interested me is how well the canola's held up, even ungrazed, to these early sowings. That's an interesting thing to follow up. But look, as I said before, it's really not the canola itself and the gross margin off that paddock that's necessarily the focus. It's actually the system's benefits. And so whilst the gross margin on a particular paddock might be 100 or 400 higher than a grain only, and depending on your enterprise, the whole farm value might be of that order, it's these sorts of benefits that people are really chasing. This is an example of a grower around the Goulburn area, and he's introduced canola into his system specifically to try and maintain his dual-purpose cereals and to get better establishment of his perennial pastures. So I'll talk a bit about some of these. This is now a focus for us, trying to look at the integration of canola into the system and what the benefits are. So we set up a large experiment as part of our new project with the GRDC, which is now saying, well, we've got those nuts and bolts right, how might it fit together in a whole farm context? And here we have large plots that are big enough to put realistic numbers of sheep on. We are allowed, we can manage the sheep, we can measure their live weight gains, we can move them around. And so we can start to look at evaluating some of those systems benefits. So we can look at the stock grazing value of the crops, we can compare them, but we can also monitor the pasture while it's being spelled whilst we're off grazing the crops, because that's a big benefit that people are chasing, that sort of pasture wedge in late winter, early autumn. So I'll show you some data from this trial. We set it up in 2009, and essentially in that experiment we've got systems that you might consider a pasture-only system where we've introduced a grazing wheat, a pasture system with a grazing canola, and then the combination of the two. We're looking for the synergies in having those two in the systems. And what we wanted to try and do was, okay, quantify the crop grazing effects on yield, and we feel like we've done a lot of that, but we can monitor that. How do the livestock go on the grazing crops? That's sort of been done. Live weight gain's good on both wheat and canola. But mainly wanted to look at what's the benefit of having that grazing crop there on your pasture growth while it's spelled. And so just to show you what things looked like last year, we got the crops in good and early last year, so there's a winter canola variety, a winter wheat variety. Here they are sort of going into the autumn with quite a lot of biomass. We then put the animals on and started grazing that down, and there's a little bit further into the grazing. And of course, while you're doing that and while you're getting the benefit of the higher biomass that these crops can produce compared to a pasture, your pasture is also being spelled. So in some treatments we continuously graze the pasture through the winter. Some had a spell while we grazed the canola or the wheat, and some had a spell while we grazed the canola and the wheat, so a much longer spell. And we monitored the crops and the animals in the system. And what I want you to focus on here is the comparisons, not the absolute values. As I said, this was a good long season, so the sorts of numbers here that we got off the grazing are probably high, but it's the comparisons and the relative effects I want you to focus on. So this is the grazing and animal production we got last year off the canola and off the wheat. And this is what we got off the system where we put the animals onto the canola and then move them onto the wheat. And so, you see quite significant amount of sheep grazing weeks. Here's expressed it here in weeks. And this is the kilo, this is the actual measured live weight gain in the animals. They were merino hoggets, so they were not anything sort of special in that context, but he just converted that to dollars. Also, we noticed that in systems where you've got a lot of winter grazing, the cereals will recover quite quickly and you may get a second graze. The canola tended to come back through the winter a bit slower. But that's the sort of value, and then there's the double treat. Now, while the animals were off grazing those crops, we were measuring the pasture biomass, as I said, on the different treatments. And this is a continuously grazed. Here's the pasture where we've taken the animals off to graze the canola. Here's the pasture biomass where we've taken the animals off to graze the wheat. And here's the one where they got a longer spell while we grazed the canola then the wheat. And this was just an ungrazed treatment we left to have just as a comparison. This is a Phalaris subclover pasture. So you can see how that pasture gets away in the winter when it's getting a spell compared to the continuously grazed. Now we monitored everything on this, the growth and how many sheep we moved around. We were trying to do all the grazing in the safe window following the best bet rules, so we're aiming to not have an impact on crop yield. Now, so what we were able to do in this experiment is to find out what are the extra grazing days we got by having that grazed crop in the system. Some come from the fact that the crop's being grazed and crop produces a lot more biomass than pasture, so that's the direct value of the grazed crop. And that's this bar here, the dark green bar, and I just showed you that data in the last slide. But after we put the animals back onto the pastures, we evaluated what the extra grazing days we got off the pasture was from having been spelled. And this bar is the extra grazing we got off those spelled pastures compared to the continuously grazed pasture. So it's an indirect benefit of having these grazing crops in the system. And I think what surprised us was just the magnitude of this compared to this. We tended to focus on this, but at least for these set of circumstances, there was an enormous benefit from the spelled pasture, and in fact, 30 to 40% of the extra grazing we got came from the spelled pasture. And just to sort of show you that the crops, this is the yield of the two, the winter wheat and the winter canola. Basically there wasn't any impact of grazing. This loss of yield from the ungrazed was just due to some ryegrass that we didn't control very well, and the sheep happened to actually help us in that regard in the wheat last year. So that was the reason for that, but certainly no effect of grazing on yield. In the canola, the yields were a little bit lower than we hoped. I think we probably didn't have the nitrogen quite where it should have been, but again, no significant effect on grazing. So in a sense, all that extra grazing's come at no cost to the crop yield. So I guess the point here is that really to capitalise on this extra feed, if you're in a mixed farming system and based on the area of your farm and your environment and your management ability of your client, in order to capitalise on the extra feed from these dual-purpose crops, you really need to increase the overall farm stocking rate. The winter DSE drives the profitability of the grazing enterprise. So there's a range of ways you can look at actually increasing the farm stocking rate, and they are some, and it really will depend on particular clients and their situation. But if you don't change your stock operation to capitalise on the crop, well, there's not much point in sort of growing big fancy crops with a lot of biomass. So this project is now part of a sort of a national project. We're hooking in with the Grain and Graze network and other networks, and we've done quite a bit of work in this area, but now there's other areas in the south, in Victoria, looking at these grazing options. It's even pushing a little bit up into the north and in some parts of the west. So we're part of a national project that GRDC's funded to look at, are there options elsewhere for these systems, and are there risks elsewhere? And certainly if you go down to some of these wetter areas down south, last year we saw obviously in low-lying areas where these crops can get waterlogged in the middle of winter, and you may not want stock on country like that, and this is a risk. And so with the sort of groups, grower groups and Grain and Graze network, we're sort of working with them. We've got trials in those areas. We're using some of our models to look at risk, and we're just working with them to talk about what are our options to reduce the risk, but still get a benefit from these crops. So once again, I'll just acknowledge all the people who've worked with this, and the take-home messages are really, yes, to get the benefit from these options, you need to get the component agronomy and livestock management right, but whole farm success is more than the gross margin off a dual-purpose crop paddock. It involves all of these sort of considerations, and I'm hoping Peter Watt will pick up on some of these from his experience, but I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions then.
John, the early sowing dates for the canola How did that impact on the first available grazing days? Have you got any comments on that?
Yep.
Trying to fine tune that.
Yep. Look, the things that you can do to increase the early feed were first sowing date. The earlier you sow, the quicker you'll get the crop to that point where you can start grazing it. Sowing density is another one. Varieties, canola, I guess, and varietal choice. So, the hybrids were better than the conventionals, and they were better than the TTs in terms of quick early biomass. Sowing early, you'll get there quicker, and you'll probably maintain the potential for more feed through the whole period. Nitrogen was an important one, but you have to be careful with the nitrogen not to overcook it because of stock health reasons. But you're always weighing that earliness against other risks. The risk of going too early and not having the moisture there to maintain the crop. This year, it might be other disease issues, aphids, viruses. But if you're just purely looking at biomass, the earlier you get the crop in, the more value you get out of it. On the Monero, southern Monero around Delegate, the grower there, John Jeffries, said that every week after the 1st of March, every week late he is after the 1st of March getting his dual purpose crops in, it costs him $100 a hectare in lost feed. So for him, that's how he looks at it. He's a pretty stock orientated operation, but yeah.
I was wondering if you're monitoring the condition of the pastures under the various treatments, particularly composition.
Yes, I'm not, but we have pasture people who, Richard Colvin and others are going to go in and monitor those plots. Yeah. Because we're interested to know whether the spelling we did last year and the hammering that the continuously grazed pasture got, not only the biomass last year, has that led to more seeding and better recruitment this year. So we will be following that through this year. They don't like doing pasture composition measurements, but we may do one pasture composition measurement, but certainly some of the pasture guys who are better than I and better trained than I to do that will be monitoring those pastures. That also may cycle back into the next crop, because if we do maintain higher clover and all the rest of it, we may fix more nitrogen. The whole system may well spiral upwards in the right direction for us. We're also going to monitor the impact. We've got ungrazed plots, so we can look at this soil structural issue that people are concerned about by integrating the crops and pastures together. So, and we're looking at water and nitrogen and how that cycles through as well.
John, just on that, what was the pasture, the type of pasture?
Phalaris clover. Yeah, it got with the wet summer last year. It got a lot of summer grass, weeds in it as well. But we sort of brought stock in. We really tried to bring stock in to have the pasture going into the winter, looking like a sort of typical Phalaris clover pasture. And I think Tim Condon came down, had a look at it, and but that's our aim. Very difficult in an experimental sense to try and set this up like a farm, because you just cannot experimentally do all of the things that farmers can do, but we're just trying to keep it sort of statistically sound, and we'll have to take those sorts of numbers that I've got and translate them to a farm that might only be 20% crop, 80% pasture or whatever. Obviously our little blocks we need to go through that sort of translational process to a whole farm enterprise. But we just need to get some numbers on the sort of responses we're looking at.
John, Sandy Biddulph from Cootamundra. I was wondering whether you've done any comparisons with a true forage rate, like a winifred or something, where you might be grazing for a more extended period, but obviously not getting the grain. And secondly, have you noticed any differences in the grazed and ungrazed with sclerotinia at the end of the year?
Yep. Okay. So on the first one, I've always had a winter fodder rape in my trials. Because I know that they've been bred and sold for stock. My first concern was the stock might not like eating canola. So early on we did preference trials and we gave them the forage ones that are being sold, and they showed no preference for canola, so we knew that they'd eat it. I've monitored the biomass production. So if you sow in March or April and you sow a Winfred versus a canola, they produce the hybrids anyway, the winter hybrids that we have, which there is one variety, Taurus, now commercially available. I mean, it wasn't when I started this work. They'll produce about the same biomass from that grazing. What else? This year, for the first time, we're trying an idea where we're sowing this winter canola in spring instead of the fodder rate. At Delegate this year, it produced about the same biomass going into the first summer graze. It's been grazed, the sheep showed no preference. What we're going to see is whether we can carry that canola right through the autumn and then have a crop next spring. So, you know, like an 18-month crop. Now, it could be insects that bring that undone, it could be other disease risks. But the growers down there said if they didn't have to put the fodder rate in, take it out, and then put a spring barley or something in, if they could leave a crop there that turned into canola, that would be useful for their system. So we're just having a look at that. But yeah, I mean, the canola hasn't been bred to be grazed, but it appears at the moment in the system to be performing well and comparable to those sort of fodder rates. But in the summer, yeah, look, I wouldn't like to comment. I think in the summer, for that summer period where you want repeated grazing, those things have been bred and selected for leaf production, continued leaf production. So we may well find that they are superior in that context, but this is the first year we'll have a look at that. Sclerotinia, we haven't had a sort of a trial that's had sufficient sclerotinia for me to give you any data on that, so I haven't got any data, but the hypothesis from what we do know would be that anything that sort of takes the bulk out of canola in that spring period, particularly if it's wet and humid, if the grazing can take the bulk out of that, which it does do, and many of the consultants commented that ease of windrowing and harvest was something that the growers saw in canola crops that had been grazed. If taking that bulk out assists to reduce the humidity and the conditions that are conducive to sclero, well, it may do, but I certainly don't have any data on that, and I don't know whether Kurt Limbeck's still here, but whether he's got a comment. But if anything, you might hypothesise that it could help to reduce sclerotinia.
Some questions about nitrogen and nitrogen management. You touched on animal health issues, and I assume you talked about nitrate poisoning. Yeah. Could you just comment on nitrogen management in a grazing crop and how it might be different to a grain-only crop, and also the risk of nitrate poisoning? Yeah. Okay.
So the nitrate poisoning, and again, I'm no expert on this. Hugh is probably the guy to talk to, but essentially any forage, not just brassicas, but any forage with high nitrate in ruminants, it gets converted to nitrite, I think, in their rumen, and that can cause health problems and death. So what you need to avoid is grazing on crops that have had recently soluble nitrogen applied to them. So you wouldn't, or paddocks that are very hot in nitrogen to start with. In that context, I guess what you want to be doing is when you go into your crop, ensure you've got adequate nitrogen to get the crop growing well and good biomass, but be careful not to overdo it. And certainly don't apply nitrogen fertiliser, in the weeks prior to grazing. So delay your nitrogen application until after you've grazed. I don't know that that's very different to a normal grain-only crop anyway, because often you'd be waiting to make that decision on a supplementary nitrogen until winter anyway. So just by delaying it until after grazing, it makes sense. The other risk factor, I think, is cool, cloudy weather when the crops, now I think this is right, but someone might correct me. I think if the crops don't have a lot of soluble carbohydrate in them, when they're ingested and they've got high nitrogen, that makes it even worse, because in the rumen that makes the nitrogen even more potent. Cattle seem to be more susceptible than sheep and more sensitive, so you have to be doubly careful with cattle. And in fact, if they're grazing canola, and even if sheep are grazing canola, some people would advise to have a roughage or some grain or some form of carbohydrate available to get the best live weight gain from those animals. But we haven't had a lot of experience with cattle. Bloat is the other thing that on canola that can be a risk with cattle, and so but I'd defer that to sort of the livestock experts in the audience. But our advice, I suppose, with canola is take all the precautions you would normally take with a forage brassica, and you probably will be okay. And in fact, canola may have less of some of those issues, but I advise people to just think of it as that. Don't put the stock on with empty guts, introduce them slowly if you can, keep an eye on them, and perhaps provide some roughage or grain or something just to get maximum live weight gains. But incidentally, the magnesium and sodium supplements, I mean, Hughes, we've done experiments in it, and you don't appear to need them on canola, oats or barley. They don't have that problem with excluding sodium, but some people just make it available because it's cheap insurance. We haven't seen any significant responses when we've done it in experimental plots, but sometimes the animals are growing so fast on these things it's hard to get a response.